Hi, this is Molly Anholm. Welcome back. We are going to continue our talk on John Singleton Copley. In the first half, we looked at his early career in Boston, and now we're going to move forward and look what happens when he goes across the pond and spends much of the rest of his life in England. In the first lecture, we looked primarily at key works like The Boy with a Squirrel and The Portrait of Paul Revere, and then we looked kind of briefly at a few others. We noticed there was some nice continuity in his style, crisp, linear, highly detailed, the use of tenebrism, light and dark, to really focus our attention on key aspects of those compositions. His amazing ability to render different fabrics and really capture an essence of the different materials from silk, satin, velvet, the glass. It's fabulous. Before we move forward and see what changes in his styles, I do want to take a quick look back at one of the portraits we only viewed briefly, and that's the portrait of Mrs. Jerathmael Bowers. She was an extremely wealthy Bostonian, comes from money, the sole heir, and then marries pretty darn well, and so she gets this beautiful portrait painted of her by Copley. When we look at this portrait, we also know that he was looking at another portrait because everything about this portrait except for her face looks exactly like this painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds. So how does that happen? There's no internet, there's no photos, and furthermore, this painting's in England, so what's going on? So the deal is, he didn't see the painting. He saw an engraving of the painting, a mezzotint by the artist James McArdle. And well, this kind of goes back to the question of his early style. When we look at his style, it has such a striking linearity to it, such a controlled precision to the edges, to the figures. Everything seems so controlled. It kind of makes sense because when we think back to what he was doing, what his training was, it was in an engraving shop. His stepfather, Peter Pelham, had been a painter, but really his main source of income was as an engraver, and that's where Copley began his training. But also, how is he seeing any artwork that wasn't being produced in the colonies? He wasn't seeing the work itself, he was often seeing engravings of this work, and all of that is, of course, going to have a striking linear style to it. And so one of the big changes that will happen when Copley goes across to England and then he takes the grand tour and he starts to see all of these great works in person. He's really seeing the originals for the first time. So he's an incredibly accomplished artist, as we can see in paintings like this. But in some ways, it's like he's seeing everything for the first time because he is. So he's going to Paris, he's going to Rome and Italy, and his mind must have just been exploding because he's seeing all of these masterworks by all of these artists for the first time in the flesh. Think of how different it is to see something on the internet and see it in person, and how radically different it must be to see something in an engraving in a small print and then see the full-blown, full-color, pigment-on-canvas painting for the first time. And so that's really the story of what's going on with Copley when he gets to England in 1774. He meets Benjamin West, he meets Sir Joshua Reynolds, countless others, and then he goes on the grand tour. Benjamin West hooks him up with an artist. They take the grand tour together, and he describes this as feasting. His eyes were feasting on all of these artworks, but it was also incredibly important. It was part of his training. It was really him maturing as an artist because his work does change. So here we have a portrait of Hugh Montgomery, painted 1780 by Copley. So this is 6 years after he gets to England. Before we talk about this portrait, I want to read this quote from Sir Joshua Reynolds, who, as we've just seen, was pretty influential for Copley. So Sir Joshua Reynolds says, "It is indisputably evident that a great part of every man's life must be employed in collecting materials for the exercise of genius. Invention, strictly speaking, is little more than a new combination of those images which have been previously gathered and deposited in the memory. Nothing can come of nothing. He who has laid up no materials can produce no combinations." So what does that mean? For Reynolds, studying from the masters was the essential part of an artist's education. It was a theme he often repeated in a series of lectures which were known as the discourses that he gave at the Royal Academy. Sir Joshua Reynolds was the founding president of the Royal Academy when it opened in 1768, and in this quote, Reynolds is crediting genius as something attained, not something an artist is innately born with, but rather the result of dedication and work. Nothing comes from nothing, Reynolds said. Instead, it is an innovative combination of tradition through which an artist will find his or her own voice. So let's see how John Singleton Copley's portrait of Hugh Montgomery in 1780 provides us such an example. So first, let's contrast it against an earlier military portrait by Copley, the portrait of General Thomas Gage. We can see that in the 12 years that have passed between these two paintings, Copley's style has changed. His brushwork has loosened up. It has become more gestural over time. When we look at these portraits, both use the background to tell us something about the key character. For Thomas Gage, it shows the present. It shows him commanding his troops in that pre-revolutionary era. For Gage was a commanding officer of those British troops. However, in the portrait of Hugh Montgomery, it is Montgomery's past, depicting his role in the French and Indian War, which is also known as the 7 Years' War, in which the Native Americans and the French battled against the forces of the United Kingdom. The distinctive attire worn by Montgomery alludes to his position. He was the commander of the 77th Regiment, the Scottish Highlanders, and we see obviously the tartan and the Scottish attire that he's wearing, his uniform. In the background, we see the battle. They were victorious in two important battles against the combined forces of the Cherokee and the French, and we see that portrayed in the background here. It is his past service, however. This is not the present for Hugh Montgomery. In the present, he has just been elected as a member of Parliament, a position he will hold on and off over the next 16 years. This really might even be considered a grand manner portrait, in that it uses elements of history painting to tell a larger story, to suggest something more about the sitter than simply a likeness. It tells us an idea of who he is. What else? What else is Copley doing? What is this pose, this very distinctive pose that we see? And what is the famous precedent of this famous pose that we see? Well, the posture or pose of Hugh Montgomery is not by chance. It is a specific position, and it was inspired by a very famous work of art, the Apollo Belvedere statue. So why would Copley do this? Well, to understand why, it's necessary to understand the widespread esteem that the statue was held in at the time. In fact, since the Italian Renaissance, when this statue was discovered, this was considered to be basically the high point of achievement of ancient Greece. We now believe this is a Roman copy of what had been an ancient Greek bronze statue, but for those at the time, from the Renaissance through the Neoclassic period and beyond, it was believed to be representative of the highest achievement of antiquity, ancient Greece and Rome. It shows physical perfection, contrapposto, which is that balance of the hips and the shoulders as the figure moves through space, and also mental acuity. For the Greeks, heroic qualities weren't just the physique, but also the intellect, and it embraces both of those. We also see the embodiment of both of those ideals in Hugh Montgomery. The pose mimics the other pose. The one foot is planted firmly, the other foot showing movement as the heel is uplifted, about to move forward. The arm stretches forward, pointing in the direction he's traveling, and yet, even with the chaos of war in the background, in the case of Copley's portrait, we see the look of perfect composure on Hugh Montgomery's face. And this is not an isolated case, as we can see in another example by who else? Sir Joshua Reynolds. In this earlier example, his portrait of Captain the Honorable Augustus Keppel, we see another overt use of the Apollo Belvedere stance to elevate the character of the sitter. So, almost done here, but before we move on, let's take a look at one more aspect of this painting, that dramatic sky, which perhaps might have been inspired not by Reynolds, but his key rival Thomas Gainsborough. Look at the similarities between these skies, most notably the total lack of blue in either one of them. For Thomas Gainsborough, there's a whole lot of rumors that have circulated about this, that he purposefully did not use blue in the sky, in the background, as a way to spite Reynolds and his constant looking back to the work of the masters of the past. But for Copley, it's a war-torn, dramatic sky. But I just want to make the comparison between the brushwork, the gesture, the powerful imagery of that sky in the background that frames the composure of the character and even makes him seem more in control, simply by creating that juxtaposition. And this is how Copley tries to create a sense of the man's ethos or his character in contrast to that pathos or emotional quality of the natural world. And speaking of pathos, we'll really get a look at the pathos of the natural world in part 3 when we look at what might be his most famous painting, Watson and the Shark.